Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining. Probably you saw in the introduction emails, but my background is pretty much all in recruiting. I've worked in a lot of mostly American tech companies, although I spent most of my career in Asia, in Japan and Singapore. But these companies have pretty standardized interview processes around the world. So I think the experiences that I've had in Asia are applicable to other countries. And I want to share a little bit today. We've got this, we've called it how to stand out in your FAANG interview. I thought about calling it like how to trick your interviewers to make them think you're better than you actually are, which sometimes I feel like that's how I sneaked into companies like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. But I do think that there are some special ways that you can prepare that will give you the best chance for success. And not just some of the obvious things like, STAR method or preparing for behavioral interview questions, but other tips that really will make you stand out because these companies are very competitive. I like to imagine that when I'm interviewing at these companies, I'll go to my first slide here. I like to imagine that, who are the other people that are probably applying for this same job? And then, what am I going to do to stand out against this kind of competition? So I prepared this slide just as like a sample candidate pool that you might see for a typical role at Google. When I was a recruiter at Google, this is often what we had, this type of candidate pool coming in for a single job. And so you'll get 2 or 3 candidates that are coming from direct competitors, doing the exact same job already at a direct competitor. And so they know the role really well, they know the competition really well, they know the trends really well. And from Google's perspective, it's just kind of a lift and shift. We're taking someone from a competitor and asking them to do something similar here. And so it's kind of like an obvious choice that, okay, these would be strong candidates. Then you've probably got some internal candidates. A lot of jobs at these companies are popular for people who want to do a career change within the company. So for any job at Google, Amazon, Microsoft, it's likely that there are other employees already at Google, Amazon, Microsoft applying for those same roles. And then you've got some other candidates that might be just like a friend of the hiring manager or a friend of one of the team members. And so there could be some bias coming into the process as well. And so, if you imagine that these are the people that you're competing against and you're not coming from this kind of background, you're at a disadvantage, from the beginning. As soon as you start out, you're going up against people who on paper may look a lot better. And so your job in the interview is to prove that actually I have some unique insights, or I have some unique background, or I have some special way of thinking that's going to make me a stronger candidate for this role, a more successful person if I were to join your team. And so if you go into an interview process with that frame of mind, I think it will influence the way that you prepare. And that's the frame of mind that I've gone into whenever I interviewed at FAANG companies, or I guess Microsoft is not a FAANG company, but still a big tech company. So let me walk into overview of the 3 kind of main topics, main tips. One is about research, one is about reflection, and one is about taking risks in the interview process. I know this is very basic. Obviously, one of the criteria for entering these companies is not that you need to be able to make attractive slides. One of my weak points is making slides, but this is what you're going to get for today. So very basic slides, but hopefully the content of what I share will be useful. Any questions before I move forward?
I think no questions so far. We can continue on.
All right. So the first recommendation I have is when it comes to research. There's all kinds of bad advice out there when it comes to interviewing. I think even the advice people say, like, be yourself. It's not necessarily bad advice, but sometimes that advice leads you to think, like, I don't need to prepare. I'll just go in, whatever they ask, I'll just be myself, say whatever I think, and hope for the best. If it's a match, if it's made to be, then I'll get the job. I do think, of course, you want your personality to show in interviews. So it's great that you want to be yourself in that sense. But I do think that going in with a lot of preparation is extremely important. And the reason is because by doing more preparation than other candidates, you give yourself a chance to really stand out because you will get some basic questions about the company, about the role, about your motivation. And the more preparation you do, the better you'll be able to answer. So I'll give a couple of examples of what I mean by this. when I was applying for Google originally, I was applying for a role that was, the title was recruiter for GTech. And I thought to myself, like, what is GTech? I have no idea what that means. And so, my first step is I Google it, like, what is GTech? And I look at, there's a basic description of, what is GTech? But it didn't really give me a sense. It was a little bit vague, like, what is that? So then I went on Google's career site and I checked all the jobs in GTech. And I read every job description that was posted for every job in GTech. And I learned a lot more about it. I connected with someone on LinkedIn that was currently working in GTech. It was like a second degree connection. I said, hey, what do you actually do there? Like, what is GTech? And they gave me some information about, like, what is GTech? How does it work with other teams? And it's pretty complex. It's a very large team within Google, but most people who aren't in Google don't know much about it. So I did all this preparation to learn about it. And I did a lot of other preparation before the interviews. I read 2 books about Google. I watched some YouTube videos, like interviews with the founders. I read articles about what's happening. I read the investor report. I probably did 40, 50 hours of preparation. And when I went to the interview, probably 90% of the things that I researched were totally useless. It didn't come up at all. But in my first interview, the first interviewer, one of the first questions he asked me was, what do you know about GTech? And because I had read all these job descriptions, because I'd had these interactions with a current team member there, I think I must have had a very robust answer about what is GTech. And you could see the interviewer when I'm answering this, like, wow, I've never heard such a comprehensive answer, from someone who doesn't already work here. And he even mentioned that. He said, I think you know more about GTech than I know. And it's a very simple question, right? And in most cases, the answer to this question is not going to play a role in whether or not you pass the interviews. But it did give me a chance to make an impression, because he definitely thought from that answer, wow, this is more than I've heard from any other candidate. Probably even some internal candidates would not have prepared to the extent that I prepared about what is GTech. Coming from a recruiter, I'm not even applying for a job in GTech. I'm coming from a role that's recruiting for GTech. And so that kind of preparation, like I said, you don't know exactly where it's going to come into play in the interview. And most of the things you prepare won't. But if you over prepare, you'll find ways to use some examples of the things that you read about. It might be, it might help you ask better questions when it gets to the end of the interview, or it might help you answer questions about, when they ask something related to their culture. Just to give one more example, there's another company I interviewed for a couple of years back, and they asked a question, like, it was final interview, and the interviewer was the president of their Japan office. And he asked me, so, as you've been preparing for this job, probably you've checked our website, you've read some news articles, like, what do you think we're doing well when it comes to hiring? And there's a lot of, basic answers. You could say, oh, I think, you have really attractive, marketing materials, or I think your website about benefits and, compensation, is really attractive. But in preparing for that interview, I'd actually gone on LinkedIn and I checked the profile of every single employee at that company in their Japan office. I went through everybody's profile and I looked at where did they work before, what kind of job did they work on. And because I had done that, it's not directly maybe related to the question that he asked, but I was able to say, like, I noticed that a lot of your employees come from a background that's not exactly relevant to the job that they're doing at your company. So it seems like you're taking people who aren't a perfect match and you're bringing them into roles and you're training them. And from my perspective as a recruiter, that's a really attractive thing, because most companies are looking for people who are already doing the exact same job somewhere else, and then they just hire them to do the job at their company. But it seems like your company is really open to hiring people who are just really good generalists, really smart. They meet your attributes. And then when you bring them in, you'll train them how to do this specific job. And again, like, there's a lot of basic answers to the question he asked, but my answer showed that I'd done a lot of preparation. I'd done a lot of pre-work. And I had some special insight, because I think they also pride themselves on the way that they bring in people from different backgrounds and then train them up. And so, that level of preparation helped me get just a little bit better answer than probably the other candidates. And you could see, again, the CEO making some, furiously typing notes as I was saying that answer. Once again, a lot of the things I prepared before that interview were they didn't come into, they were totally useless in the interview process. But a few things that I did actually helped me to stand out a little bit more than other people. So when I say do your research, of course, you want to do the basic research, check the stock price, and make sure you understand the job description. But the deeper you can go, the better. And I know this does take a lot of time. Like I said, 40 to 50 hours of prep I probably did before my Google interviews. And if you're applying for 10 or 15 jobs, there's just no way physically that you can do that. So I do recommend, focus on maybe 1 or 2 jobs at a time so that you can do that level of preparation that will help you stand out. I'm going to go to the next slide unless there are any questions.
Yes, we have a question for you. Google has HC, so the hiring manager can't play into the decision until team matching after getting past HC. Is that correct?
So it's a little bit different if you're applying for engineering roles versus non-engineering roles. In both cases, there's usually a hiring committee, although that's changing in some teams these days. But in Eng, yeah, I believe that the hiring committee, which does not include the hiring manager, would make a decision, hire or no hire, and then there is a matching process afterwards to say, okay, you have the general Eng or program management skills, and then we have to find a role for you. So that is correct. For non-Eng roles, again, you'll have the hiring committee in many cases. But still the hiring manager's opinion counts strongly because they're going to type up all their feedback. Their feedback is included in the packet of information that goes to the hiring committee, and the hiring manager's input, of course, weighs heavily on the hiring committee's decision. So yes, Google does like to separate out the hiring manager from being the final decision maker, but obviously the hiring manager does play an important role in their opinion counts. I see a question here. What is the minimum rating for hiring committee that's required to approve your packet? There's no minimum rating. I mean, in the packet, they will rate your whatever attributes they test. So if we're speaking about Google specifically, they'll rate general cognitive ability, leadership, Googliness, and role-related knowledge. And they give it a rating like strong hire, higher, leaning no hire, no hire, or strong no hire. And generally, you need to have like higher and above from all 3 or 4 of your interviews in order for your packet to be sent to the hiring committee. There are cases where you have maybe 3 higher ratings and 1 leaning higher, and it'll still go to the hiring committee. But generally, a leaning higher, they feel like if interviewers have some doubts, then we should look for someone who's a strong hire across the board. Yeah, hopefully that answers that question. We will have a session afterwards where we can do some more Ask Me Anything for some specific questions. All right, let me go on to the next one here, which is about reflection. And this is really, I think, where people could spend a lot more time. And when I do coaching, this is where I spend a lot of my time, which is on trying to anticipate what questions the company is going to ask to you. And there's a lot of information out there. It almost feels like cheating sometimes when, if you just do a search online, you can find out, what are the most common questions. On any company's website, they'll have articles about the most common attributes that they test for, about their culture. And if you check these things, you really can anticipate quite accurately what they're going to ask you about. So in Amazon's case, they have I think it was 14, now it's 16, leadership attributes. The interviewers are pulling their questions from a database, and all the questions are tied to some of those attributes. So you can definitely prepare by looking at those attributes and making sure that you have examples that are going to highlight your experience related to customer obsession or, hire and develop the best. All these attributes, they're public information. And so as you prepare, you can prepare for any questions that are related to those companies' specific values. So I mentioned for Amazon, if you're applying for Microsoft, there's likely going to be questions about growth mindset. That's something that they really value at Microsoft. Your ability to continuously learn and develop. At Google, they value. You might have seen that, like the 10 things we hold to be true. They've got don't be evil. They've got oxygen attributes, which are for managers, and all this information you can find this. And if you read those things in advance, it'll help you to prepare examples, not for a specific question, because there's all kinds of ways that they can phrase a question, but for a specific attribute that they're going to be testing, you can prepare those examples so you're not taken by surprise. And then on top of that, you should be prepared for the the normal interview questions that you get at any company, your major successes, major failures that you've had, experiences with teamwork, leadership, all these kinds of things that most companies will ask about. So yeah, prepare those things. Most companies ask these things. You should be ready to be asked those things. And that way, some of the questions that you get, there's just no way to prepare. There's all kinds of things. But I would say 60, 70%, sometimes even 80% of the questions you get asked, you can prepare for those. You can have answers ready so that when they ask it, you don't have to spend time thinking. And again, when I've interviewed at any of these tech companies, probably when it comes to recruiting, I know they're going to ask about, using data to solve a customer problem. I know they're going to ask about diversity and inclusion. Because I'm a manager, I know they're going to ask about, how do I develop team members? Or what do I do if I have someone underperforming in my team? Those questions, I know those questions are coming. So it would be my own fault if I don't prepare for those kinds of things. And then last, you should think about the actual role that you're applying for. Imagine yourself doing that role. Just like in sports, they say you should envision yourself in the game, visualize yourself like scoring the basket or, scoring the goal. You should visualize yourself in an interview, visualize yourself in the job. If I join this company in this role, this is probably what I'm going to be working on in the first 3, 6, 9, 12 months. This is probably the challenges that they're going through. If it's me, here's what I'm going to do if I face that kind of challenge. And so again, using my own example, like if you're applying for a role in recruiting in tech industry these days, every tech company is struggling to hire as much as they want to. All these companies are growing really quickly. They have a huge demand to find people who are skilled, but all the companies are looking for the same small pool of people. And so basically every company is behind on hiring. Every tech company is behind on hiring. And so I need to know that as a recruiter, if I'm moving into this role, they're going to expect me to have a plan for how to get back on track. And so before the interview, I should have that plan mapped out. And I should think about, in this particular company, this is probably what I would do. This is the data that I would want to gather. These are the people I would want to talk to. These are the stakeholders I need to influence. And here's the proposal I would make for us to get back on track with hiring. Again, you don't have to wait for that question. That's the kind of question where if you haven't prepared ahead of time, a lot of candidates will get stuck on that. But if you have prepared ahead of time, you'll definitely stand out. I've got just 1 or 2 more slides, and I see a lot of questions have come in. Are there a couple that we should focus on now?
Yeah. Maybe this one, maybe we have a few people that might be interested. If I fail in a past Google interview and now apply for the same position again, would a past failure be a negative thing and have less possibility to be interviewed?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, I think it's more than half of people who get hired at Google have previously been rejected for another role. So it's very common that someone gets rejected and then they come back 6 months later or 12 months later and they interview again and then they get hired. It does depend on a few things. One is it the exact same role, or is it a related role or a slightly different role? If it's the exact same role, you probably don't want to interview 3 months later, because the result is likely to be the same. 6 months later or 12 months later, you'll have some additional experience, maybe some additional perspectives, and so you definitely can get another chance. It also depends on why you were rejected. Again, if you were only rejected because they ended up hiring an internal candidate, then sure, of course, you can interview again. And that's actually the most common reason for rejection, not just at Google, but Microsoft and probably Amazon as well. It's not because somebody made a mistake in the interview. It's not because you failed. It's because somebody else just did a little bit better. And often when I would reject candidates, when I was a recruiter at Google, they would say, what did I do wrong? And the real answer is you didn't do anything wrong. You didn't actually make any mistakes. It's just that somebody else did spectacularly in some other area. And so in many cases, if you're getting rejected, it's not because you failed. It's just because somebody else was more successful. And so in those cases, again, absolutely, you can apply again. There are times if you get rejected at Google because of general problem solving skills, for example, that's going to be a little bit harder because there's a perception that general cognitive ability doesn't change very much over time. Whereas something like role-related knowledge or leadership, with experience, you'll get more role-related knowledge, you'll get more leadership, and therefore a year later, even if you failed, you'll have a chance to have improved over time. So yeah, hope that answers that question. Should we do maybe one more?
Awesome. Yes, let's just do one more. And just so everybody knows, all the questions that you've asked on the chat box, if Kevin doesn't answer it now, we're going to bring it over to our community's live Ask Me Anything session. I'll be typing out all your questions there, and then you'll be answering it after this workshop. And then everybody can hop on over if you have more questions after this as well. Okay, let's tackle one more. Says, yeah, I've had the hesitation to browse LinkedIn profiles of employees at Microsoft. Looks like it is not taken seriously or in a negative way by them.
I don't have that that perception. For me, it's a sign that someone is preparing. I often see before I interview candidates, I'll see that they checked my LinkedIn profile. I'll check theirs as well. I don't have any kind of negative bias about that. I think it's a sign that someone is preparing. So if anything, I have a positive perception of people who are doing that research. And yeah, you can change your settings so that somebody won't be able to see your name, that you checked their profile. But honestly, I think that it's, for me, it's a good thing that somebody is actually checking, okay, what's my interviewer's background? What did they do before? Maybe they'll have some questions. I often get a question, when I went from Google to Microsoft, every candidate I interview at Microsoft says, why did you leave Google? What's some of the differences between Google and Microsoft? And to me, that's a sign that they're preparing, they're curious, and they're eager and interested. So no negative impression of that from my side.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much, Kevin. Let's move on to the next slide, and then we can continue with a bit of other questions after.
All right. This next slide, I think it has a little bit of a negative tone in this next slide, but what I'm trying to show here is that, interviewers at many of these companies, interviewing is not their core job, right? Engineering is their core job, or sales is their core job, or strategy is their core job, and interviewing is something they do kind of because they have to in many cases. And so you'll find all kinds of interviewers. Some are going to be very engaged, some are going to be really bored, some are going to be really enthusiastic, some are going to be almost rude. But I try to go in interviewers, into interviews kind of assuming the worst. Assume that the person who's interviewing me doesn't want to be there. They've done 10 interviews this week and they're behind on their other job, and now they've got another person they have to assess. And if they're coming to it from that perspective, I want to make this worth their time. I want to make it interesting for them as well. It's kind of like you get bonus points, for making it interesting, because if they've done, like I have, hundreds and hundreds of interviews, and I'm asking a lot of the same questions because they're standard questions. And in most cases, I've heard 95% of the answers, I've heard them all before. And that doesn't mean like if you give me an answer I heard before that, I'm going to reject a candidate. But if I ask a question that I've asked 100 times before and somebody gives me a unique answer, it like makes my heart beat a little bit faster. I get goosebumps like, ooh, that's a unique perspective. Even if it's wrong, I like hearing a unique perspective, right? Because I've heard so many things from so many candidates, very standardized kind of answers. And if I get something that I haven't heard before, I start to get more engaged, right? As an interviewer, I'm, ooh, this person has a unique thought process or a unique perspective on this. Now I want to hear more. And so that's what I mean by, take a risk. You'll get some questions, and when you get a question, your first reaction is going to be, to say the first thing that comes to mind. I want to answer quickly. We have limited time, but stop and think, like, if this is the same answer that every other candidate is going to give, maybe I should think a little bit more deeply. Maybe I should take some time to say something unorthodox or say something that might be a little bit strange or controversial. Interviewers are going to love to hear something that's controversial. They're going to love to hear strong opinions because they've heard all the weak opinions and all the normal opinions before. So I have a couple of examples of this. I know we're short on time, but I remember, again, I'll use a Google example. When I interviewed there, one of the interviewers asked me, what do you think is the biggest threat to Google's business in the next 5 years? And I think my initial idea was, well, probably, Facebook or Meta now for advertising, or when it comes to ads like AWS and Microsoft, these are the biggest threats to, to Google's business. But every person who's interviewing at Google can answer that same thing. I think that's not really a novel answer. And so then I tried to think a little bit more deeply, like, well, what else, might be a challenge for Google? And I thought, well, because I'd done a lot of preparation, Google is trying to expand into a lot of unique businesses like self-driving cars or like internet balloons. And for these types of businesses, there's no rules yet, there's no laws. And in fact, if Google tries to launch these, probably like regulators, lawyers, there's going to be a lot of pushback to making these into actual businesses, like turning an idea, into a viable business or product. And so I think I answered something about, regulators and lawyers, and that might be a wrong answer, but it's probably not the typical answer that they get. And so again, you get like some bonus points because it's an atypical answer. But I could have chosen any other kind of directions. Right now, maybe hiring is the biggest barrier to Google's growth. Google has still like 30% year-over-year revenue growth. They need to hire 20,000 people, 30,000 people a year, and they're like running out of people that they can hire. Amazon as well, in their warehouses. In the US, I think they have probably 1 million employees, and basically everyone that they can interview, they've already interviewed. So they're running out of people. So for some of these companies, maybe hiring is the biggest threat to their business, not actual companies or competitors. It's some other problems, like hiring could be the reputation. Again, some tech companies have bad reputations that can impact hiring, that can impact customers signing up. So for these kinds of questions, I really think it helps to think a little bit outside the box. That means it takes a little bit of cognitive ability on your side to think about what is the normal answer and then go a step beyond. But if you can say something that your interviewer hasn't heard before, it gets them excited, it gets them interested, and it gets them thinking, there's a lot of people doing similar jobs, in my team already, but this person's going to bring something new. This person has this spike that's going to help everyone on my team be better because they have a unique perspective. Interviewers really value a unique perspective. So it's not just about getting the right answer or the safe answer. It's about having a unique perspective to stand out in a lot of these jobs. So that's it for my slides. I know we will head over to the community now to answer a couple of other questions. Do we want to do one more question while we're still on the video?
Yeah, okay, let's do one more. This must be, yes, is by Amazon. Other than over preparation of the leadership principles, do you have any recommendations on how to stand out at Amazon?
Yeah, I mean, I do think over preparation on the leadership principles is the best one, because they pull their questions. For each job, they're going to think these are the 4 leadership principles that are probably the most relevant to this job, and then their questions are going to come from that. I do think, again, Amazon is going to have a lot of applicants for every role. So in addition to the over preparation, try to think about your own experience and what they're expecting, and what have I done that's different from all the other people who've done this similar job before. If you're doing sales, Amazon is expanding into advertising, for example. If you're coming from an advertising background, you need to think about, like, what is the typical candidate, what is their perspective on advertising business, and then where do I have some unique perspectives? Where am I going to add value beyond what everybody else who's applying for this role can add value? So expect that because Amazon is a popular company, that they're getting applicants who have on paper all the exact experience. But if they're all giving the standard answers, the way you can stand out is by giving a little bit of a novel answer, something with some unique insights. What exactly that is, it depends on the role. So, if you have a coach who specializes in that area, they might be able to tell you, if it comes to recruiting, for example, I think I have some unique perspectives, having done it for a long time. And when I do my interviews, I do take those risks to show, like, hey, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, I think most companies are doing it wrong, and this is why, and this is how I would do it differently. So those kinds of points, like, most people think this way, but I don't. I think this way, and here's why. If you have those kinds of examples, I think those will help you stand out.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin. Any just last words, last advice that you want to give to everyone on how they could stand out in FAANG interviews before we go off?
I hope this was, fairly succinct and helpful. Interviewing is a skill, and like any other skill, you can get better with practice. But there's a lot of practice you can do on your own. Of course, I recommend, getting a coach if you can, but there's a lot of preparation you can do on your own, just thinking deeply about your own experience, the best things that you've done, the worst things you've done, why you did them that way, how you might do them differently in the future. So you can prepare those things without a coach. And then if you can practice those things with a coach, you'll be best prepared to do well in these interviews. So thank you, everyone.